rainy night of silent love. One unexpected rainy night, the city remained as bustling and lively as ever, but at night, each raindrop falling through the air seemed like a secret whisper, stirring a profound sadness that seeped into the streets. It wasn't the gentle rain of March or the hurried downpour of July, but a persistent, unforeseen storm, as if the sky itself was testing the hearts weary of this hectic life. The neon lights from shops reflected on the wet streets, creating shimmering streaks of light, yet their glow wasn't enough to dispel the loneliness in one person's eyes. Minnie, a young woman, stepped out of a restaurant, her hand gently clutching her purse. Her walk was graceful, but her eyes were filled with sorrow. She carried no umbrella, didn't call a taxi, and chose to walk in the rain, as if trying to escape the chaos within her heart. Unbeknownst to her, across the street, someone was waiting. It was none other than Yulong, a quiet yet powerful presence. He had arrived earlier than she expected, not entering the restaurant, not calling, not leaving a message. He simply stood there under the increasingly heavy rain, without an umbrella, arms gently crossed, his eyes fixed on the restaurant's main door where Minnie emerged. Some might call him foolish, but those who have truly loved would understand that sometimes silence speaks the loudest. Yulong wasn't there to ask questions or demand reasons. He only needed to prove one thing: even if she turned away, he would stay. Even if she was weak, conflicted, or exhausted, he would choose to stand there, waiting. The rain seemed to linger deliberately, as if testing how long he could endure. But Yulong didn't budge, his presence not a coincidence but a choice for one person, and one person alone. People often think men are only vulnerable when drunk, but in truth, their most fragile moments often have nothing to do with alcohol. Yulong was proof of that. Minnie noticed him a few meters from the restaurant. At first, she was surprised, then so overwhelmed she couldn't speak. She paused, eyes wide for a moment, then looked down, as if afraid his gaze could read every corner of her heart. He said nothing, and neither did she. In that moment, all misunderstanding seemed trivial. He wasn't there to explain or seek forgiveness. His patience, his steady gaze, and his unwavering stance in the rain were the answer. There were no questions, only hearts that had been silent too long. Minnie's cheeks flushed, not from embarrassment but from the overwhelming tenderness of someone who understood her better than she understood herself. All her anger, all her conflicts, suddenly vanished, as if those negative emotions were waiting for his presence to be released. Waiting wasn't painful for Yulong, it was a choice. People say waiting is one of love's greatest pains, but pain only comes when waiting is in vain. For Yulong, there was no despair. He stood there with a simple yet profound belief that Minnie would appear, and she was worth the wait. He didn't seek shelter under an awning or stop at a roadside cafe. He didn't check his phone for the time or text anyone. He stood in the rain, as if time had frozen and the world around him no longer mattered. Each raindrop on his soaked shoulders didn't make him shiver, not because he wasn't cold, but because something warmer burned in his heart, her image. He feared that if he left, she wouldn't see him, would feel lost, and stumble into a void where no one welcomed her. That's why, despite the rain, the wind, or the long night, he chose to stay. No one forced him, his heart simply wouldn't let him leave. Love doesn't need validation. This city is accustomed to flamboyant embraces, passionate declarations before cameras, or loud romances that fizzle like fireworks. But true, deep love often chooses silence to endure. Yulong didn't post pictures or update his status. He didn't need friends to know or anyone to validate his love. He only needed her to know, and that was enough. When Minnie walked toward him, her step slowed, as if afraid that moving faster would make the scene vanish like a dream. But he remained, his eyes gentle, his shoulders trembling slightly in the rain, a hint of shyness like a boy seeing his love after a long absence. She stood before him, asking nothing. He explained nothing. There was only a thick, understanding silence. Then, as if by instinct, she leaned forward, resting her head on his shoulder. In that moment, Yulong closed his eyes, not to avoid the rain, but to savor her warmth in the cold night. There was tenderness, a touch of heartache, but above all, an explosion of faith in a love that didn't need to shout. The world moves too fast. People learn to love quickly, leave quickly, and forget quickly. A message unanswered in 10 minutes can wound, a wrong word can end a relationship. But Yulong didn't belong to that rushed world. His love for Minnie was slow, steady, and silent, not loud, controlling, or demanding. It was a strength that kept her eyes on him. He wasn't there to prove anything or play the hero. He was there because his heart had nowhere else to turn but to her. Minnie had been surrounded by men loved in grander ways, but none were willing to stand silently in the rain for her, without reason or promise, simply because she was the only one worth waiting for. Sometimes, rain doesn't just wet the earth, it soothes parched souls scarred by hurt. That night, the rain was a miracle, not a barrier, washing away the unspoken between them. As Minnie rested on Yulong's shoulder, she needed no apologies, no justifications, no explanations for why he stood there in the freezing rain. His soaked, steadfast presence was the most honest confession her heart had ever heard. He gently reached out, unhurried, taking her hand, not possessively, but enough to melt the ice in her heart. They began walking slowly through the rain, unhurried, undeterred, as if the rain no longer bothered them but became a witness to two lost souls finding each other. Their steps echoed softly on the streets, blending with the patter of rain, like a gentle but meaningful love song. They said nothing, but their hearts spoke fully. In that silence, love was redefined. No grandeur, no fanfare, just being there at the right moment. Love isn't for everyone, except for one person. Yulong wasn't the typical cinematic man. He didn't drive luxury cars, wasn't skilled at grand gestures, or adept at sweet words. But his awkwardness made his love strangely reliable. Minnie once thought she needed a strong, decisive man who always knew how to make her happy. But after past relationships, she realized she simply needed someone who wouldn't leave when things got tough. Yulong was that person. He loved her in his own way, not with expensive bouquets, but by quietly watching over her, not with daily I love yous, but with a simple, never forgotten question, have you eaten? His love wasn't for everyone. Not everyone was patient enough to understand him, or perceptive enough to see the emotions hidden in his eyes, in his silence. But Minnie saw, and that's why she returned. True love doesn't need to prove itself to the world. It only needs to be deep enough for the other to feel it. Sometimes, Minnie wondered why he appeared when she was at her weakest, why he didn't leave like other men. Yulong never answered, not because he lacked one, but because true love needs no reason. People don't love because someone is beautiful, talented, or smart. They love because their heart chooses to. He didn't blame her when she turned away, didn't resent her silence. He waited patiently, steadfastly, like a lover so gentle it pained her. Whenever she was disappointed with the world and turned back to find him still there, her heart softened again, not because he lacked pride, but because her peace mattered more to him than anything. He wasn't there because he had no career or busyness, but because she was the one he didn't want to miss, not even once. That rainy night, all his silent choices were answered. Love is when the world doesn't need to know, only one person does. On social media, people count likes to measure affection, gauge love by wedding photos, trips, flowers, or gifts. But if love must be proven that way, how many relationships truly endure? Yulong didn't need Minnie to post about him, to share photos, or to declare, "This is the man I love." He only needed her to know, when she was weary, that he was there. A promise sealed in the rain. As they walked hand in hand, the rain began to soften, as if the sky, satisfied with its test, had decided to let them be. The city's neon lights still flickered, but their glow now felt like a quiet celebration of this unspoken reunion. Minnie's heart, once heavy with doubt and turmoil, felt lighter with each step beside Yulong. His presence was a vow, one that needed no grand ceremony or public declaration. It was a promise carved in the patience of waiting, in the courage to stand through a storm, and in the simplicity of choosing her above all else. They stopped under a dim street lamp, the rain now a gentle drizzle. Minnie looked up at Yulong, her eyes no longer clouded by sadness but sparkling with a newfound certainty. "Why do you always know when I need you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pattering rain. Yulong smiled, a rare, soft curve of his lips that held 1,000 unspoken words. "Because you're my reason," he replied, his voice steady yet tender, like the rain that had brought them together. In that moment, the world faded, the bustling city, the fleeting judgments of strangers, the weight of past mistakes. All that remained was the truth of their bond, unspoken yet undeniable. They didn't need a stage, a crowd, or a spotlight. Their love was their own, a quiet symphony played in the rhythm of raindrops and heartbeats. As they continued down the street, side by side, the rain became not just a backdrop but a blessing, sealing their promise to face every storm together. For Yulong and Minnie, that rainy night wasn't just a memory, it was the beginning of a love that would endure, silently, steadfastly, forever.